I know I actually, this is the much more fun seminar, the better talk to give. The other one, I mean, you really need to get into what we got into last night, because I think sometimes, again, if we don't understand the depth of the issue and what's really happening, solutions can just be, they can be a little flaky or whatever. So I know we need to go there, but I always feel really bad when, people are giving up a night at home to relax and put their feet up, and they walk out the door going like, oh, well, that's not so great, So anyway, so tonight we'll tell you how to fix everything, and you can all write best-selling books, and it'll be really good. So yeah, but anyways, we'll just a quick recap actually. So this is where there we go. This is where we started yesterday. And we're just kind of saying that when we're talking about the current crisis, the place that we're in right now, it is not the result of any one thing. It is not the result of, Steve Jobs inventing an iPhone. It is the result of three things kind of colliding, that we've got some unique stuff going on in adolescent development. And the key thing there is this big word called individuation. It is this natural, normal, healthy process where children become adults, and it's a little bit of a stretch in transition, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out who they are when they're away from mom and dad. Who are they when they're away from their family of origin? And that should happen. That's a good thing to have happen. But what complicates it is when it's happening inside of a culture where we see what we would actually, the technical term for it is orphaning structures. And so orphaning structures are structures that isolate young people from adult support. And so we see that quite a bit in culture, and the example I gave that's probably the most helpful in a recap is to remember that book Hurt 2.0, Chap Clark, spending his time in this high school and saying that the one commonality among all of the students in that school was that they would show adults the face, or put the mask on really, that reduced the likelihood of rejection the most. Because all of the relationships that they had with adults were actually performance-oriented. Mom and dad want me to behave well and clean my room. My teachers want better grades. My coach wants me to run faster and jump higher, and and on and on and on. My youth group leader wants me to read the Bible more. And so this idea that everyone demanded something of me really kind of led them into this underworld thing. And so we have this individuating going on, while at the same time we have teenagers who are essentially trying to carve out for themselves a place in an adult-free world. And then you add to that the rise of technology and how that changes the way we interact with each other. That our society is currently being shaped and driven and changed by a brand new medium. And so all of a sudden, all of the world's information is at your fingertips instantaneously, and yet you have no idea what to do with it all. And so that's a completely different paradigm. And so in the context of all of that, where we landed really yesterday was to say that the crisis is that teenagers are isolated. They're isolated. They've been systematically abandoned in our culture. And so what we get to today is the big question. So what on earth do we do? And that's, of course, why we actually came here today. And so what I want to do is I want to look at what are the best things that we can do to, like Lisa said, to respond and not react. And that really is the key, because I think what happens is that there's going to be things that are sort of the knee-jerk reaction. Even when we were talking about what was going on yesterday, there were probably a couple of thoughts that you had of saying, well, if that's what's going on here, then we need to get a little more of this going on. And so now here's the thing. Some of those things that you were thinking may be exactly the best thing to do. Others of them maybe aren't so much. The thing that I've noticed is that there are some great solutions, but many of them feel counterintuitive initially. And so what we want to do is we want to actually break things down into each of those four circles and really break it down into what's kind of the one overarching response in this circle that will be the most helpful. And so that's why on your handout you've got a little box under each circle, and I want to give you one thing in each sphere that will probably be helpful. Just very, very practically. And so let's kind of get started with this question of individuation. So as young people are going through this, they're not a child anymore, they're not quite an adult yet, and so everything in their lives is changing. What is the best response we can have. The key thing is actually celebrating. This needs to be something that we do an exceptional job as parents, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, as community youth workers, as pastors, as teachers, as anyone who's interacting with young people. There needs to be intentional celebration around this stage of life. And we're going to talk about just briefly why that is. The first big reason is because individuating is a good thing. It is a good thing because most of the parents I talk to don't love the thought or the prospect of having, a 27-year-old living in their basement who never moved out. They love their kids, but they're like, there comes a time, hon, where you're going to have to get out there and have your own house. And so, individuating is a good thing because until we can, if we don't individuate well, okay, if we don't figure out, remember there's 3 big questions that everybody's asking, but they're red hot when you're in adolescence, which is, who am I? Where do I belong? And what is my purpose? And individuating is asking those questions for the very first time, and these are red hot questions. The difference is that when you're in your 40s and you're asking these questions, it's not with the same burning urgency. And we have a lot of life experience to fall back on. So when something changes, when the job market changes, and we say, man, I used to do this for a living, but that job doesn't even exist anymore. Now what's my purpose? We still have a lot of life experience to build on so it doesn't plunge us into a total existential crisis, hopefully. But for young people, they don't have anything else to draw on because it's the first time their brains have thought of these questions. And so they're pushing really hard. And so we want to celebrate individuation because it is a thing that is good and should be happening. And so celebrating actually looks like affirming this stage in the lives of our young people with appropriate freedom. And so one of the things we talked about yesterday was that Robert Epstein did an interesting study, and it's like academically sound in every way. It says this is a former professor of psychology at Harvard and editor of Psychology Today. And in his book, Teen 2.0, he points out that the average 16-year-old in Western culture has more restrictions on their lives than someone who is an incarcerated felon. Okay, there are more rules about what you cannot do and how you will do it as a 16-year-old than there is if you were to actually be in prison. So for most 16-year-olds, from the standpoint of where they fit into society, if they were to go to jail, they would have more autonomy and freedom than they would in their lives. Now that may sound shocking, but this is just the way we looked at it. No, and it's even down to little things like, so maybe you've never thought about this, but let me just give you an example. It's the thing of, you ever see those signs in a store where it says, only 2 persons under the age of 18 allowed in the store at a time unless accompanied by an adult? Now think about that for a second. This is the last legalized discrimination that's tolerated in our country. And what message does that send to you? You're not trustworthy. You're bad. You need to be supervised. Okay, can I just point out, if we have 17-year-olds that can't go into the corner store without being supervised because we are really worried as a society this is going to just be mayhem, quite frankly, we've got a bigger problem. And so there are restrictive policies like that don't make a whole lot of sense. And what they actually do is they're very counterproductive. And so every time young people do something bad, the general response is to clamp down and create further and further and further restrictions. But all of the research we have suggests that ironically, when you actually take the restrictions off, and you introduced most young people to a world where there will be natural consequences for your actions, not fabricated consequences to your actions, that is actually the cause of maturity. So what I mean is if you break a rule and you're 16 and the consequence is that you get grounded and somebody takes your iPad away, Those are artificial consequences. Those are things that were, and they kind of get it. They're like, well, this is just the system, and maybe I can game my way out of this, and maybe I can negotiate and bargain, and maybe there's this and this and this. But if you live in this world where it's like, you have all the freedom to do whatever you want, but this is what will happen to you. So, for example, to say, this is going to sound crazy, by the way, and if this is completely nuts and you think it's terrible, I'm sure that, Lucas and Lisa will sort you all out afterwards and tell you not. There's like, don't worry about what he said. He's nuts. He doesn't know what he's saying. But here's just a crazy thing. There's something actually, it's counterintuitive. There's something actually healthy that usually happens when you sit down with a 16-year-old and you actually give them permission. You say, listen, over the next couple of weeks, I want you to do a little bit of homework about career stuff. And I just want to let you know that if you want to drop out of school and not go back, I'll never make you. If you want to drop out of high school and never go back, I won't make you. You can leave school. You can be done. I don't care. Do whatever you want. I just want to make sure you understand what your options are. So realistically, just look at it. So all of a sudden, it's not, I have to go to school because I'll be in trouble if I don't, whatever. All of a sudden, when you have this 16-year-old, like, okay, I don't actually have to go here. But I could actually mess my life up a little bit if I don't graduate high school. That's a really, really helpful paradigm to most teens. And then, of course, this whole thing, I know my kids just be like, sweet, I'm not going. Well, it's interesting. So what happens when they're 18 years old and they say, oh my gosh, I know what I want to do. I want to do this. Oh, I didn't graduate from high school. They might go back. They might actually finish. And they might have learned a valuable lesson that they take into adulthood at age 18 that says, wow, there are real natural consequences for my actions. Now, before you think I'm just advocating the most radical parenting approach you've ever heard in your life, what I need to give you a little bit of framework to is, if you have a 16-year-old that has never experienced natural consequences even once in their entire lives, the first natural consequences they experience should probably not be, you don't have to go to school anymore. Because if all of the consequences they've experienced have been consequences that aren't really real, they might be tempted to believe that the consequences of dropping out of school at 16 are not really real. Because they've never had real consequences. But the idea is we want to introduce real world consequences as quickly as possible. And so it becomes this thing that, we started with our kids, they would get their birthday money. When we're really little, we give them a little bit of guidance. So, you're not going to really be happy with yourself if you blow your money on this. When you're 5 years old, we give a little bit more guidance. By the time they're 10, it's like, whatever, it's your money. Do whatever you want with it. There's a few times they spent all of it, and then really quickly we're like, I don't really, all that candy, I just wish I had that money back. Well, you spent it. They're really good at handling money. Why? Because there were natural consequences. This is your money, you do what you want, but they're experiencing natural consequences. Though that's generally what we see as lacking in this stage of development, is there's not this celebration of, this is so cool that you are figuring out who you are as a person, and as mom and dad, man, we just think this is awesome, and we just want this to happen with you. Like, this is great. And sometimes it is like the I'm trying so hard to smile when you're like, man, this is so great that you're pushing back on every rule in our house. I love this so much because it just shows me how smart you are and how awesome you are, whatever. But the thing is that generally what we experience in this stage as parents is a lot of dread and a lot of turmoil. And we have the opportunity, if we can recognize that it's actually a healthy process at its root, and we can shift our attitude around it, what can actually happen is it can become less stressful and more helpful, right? So celebrating the stage, celebrating the push to independence, giving appropriate freedom and responsibility. I just believe that by the time a kid is 16 years old, they should have had the opportunity to fail and experience consequence naturally, not because mom and dad made consequences. Because that is, and as a protecting students and kids from that, it's generally one of the most detrimental things that they experience. So with that, here's the most important thing there, is we need to speak life into our teens. And celebrating this stage of life for them is really about speaking life into them. Imagine this, you're part of a generation that everyone has something negative to say about you. So parents, grandparents especially, what do you speak into your kids' lives? What do you speak over their lives? What do they hear you say about them? And what do they hear you say about their generation? So to be celebrating this unique stage of life in a way that's helpful turns into that my kids are never going to hear me speak badly about people their age. In fact, every time I tell our leaders this on a regular basis, I said, every time you're being baited into saying something that you're like, I'm just so frustrated. I always just tell them, just as long as you get these words out of your mouth, you'll finish the sentence and it'll be okay. The words that need to come out of your mouth is, but what I really love about that person is, and then you got to finish the sentence. So something crazy comes on the news and it's like, this generation, so that's terrible what happened. But what I really love about this generation is, your kids need to hear you say it. Because if adolescents hear adults saying what they love about this generation, what they love about their peers, what they love about them, they're smart. You can tell them that. I love that this generation is so smart. They are so entrepreneurial. They have such a great work ethic, which, by the way, they do. That's a whole other thing, but don't believe there's a lot of media sensation about, there's a really, really entitled and lazy. It's like, they're actually not, just so you know. They've a profound work ethic, especially Generation Z, the ones born after 2000. Like, it's ridiculous how hard they can work. Now, getting them to work and what motivates them is a whole other seminar, but that's, anyways. So how are you speaking life over them? Just as a parent, can I just challenge you on something? This is a commitment that Amber and I made when our kids were born. And it's what I always hate to use like real life examples like this because I worry whenever I'm telling you something I did that was like, wow, we did this really well. I don't want everyone to be like, well, weren't you guys the perfect parents? Like, we screwed up a lot of stuff, okay? So for every good thing I tell you we did, make sure you're being like, yeah, but you probably sucked at that, and that's true. But one of the things I felt like we did really well is we decided when our kids were born that we were never going to say anything negative about them to anyone, ever. Now, just one moment. We doesn't mean that we ignored problems we're having. Doesn't mean we're like whatever. But what the thing is there's a difference about saying we're really struggling to figure out how to parent through this versus my kid is driving me nuts. Like that thing. We've just never said that. We've never said that to any of our friends. We've never said it to any of their friends. We never said it to them. Those words have just never come out of our mouths because we wanted to commit ourselves to just really, really just taking a positive approach, to being like, we're not going to rip on our kids to people. Because part of that was an extension of our marriage. I mean, Amber and I decided when we got married that we just were never going to speak negatively about each other to anyone for any reason. And we have a problem, we can go to the therapist and sort it out there, or, certainly we can talk to our friends about saying, man, I'm struggling to be a better husband here. I'm struggling to figure out how to do this. But we just wouldn't ever say negative things about the people in our family to anyone, because then everyone in our family knows that no matter what happens, and we're not going to say negative things about them. They feel safe. There's trust. So that may seem like a huge shift, but if we're celebrating adolescence, we need to speak great things about adolescence. And about our families, and about our kids, and about our grandkids. Last thing I'll say about just this stage is just remember that relationships are everything. So parent your teens in such a way that they want to come home as adults. So, that is probably the best parenting advice I've ever gotten, is they say when you're parenting your kids, you're parenting them in such a way that they're going to want to come home later as adults, that they want to be with you, do they want to be with the family. If relationship is everything, it means that the rules in our house are not really about the rules for the rules' sake. They're about rules for the sake of relationship. Why can't you lie in our house? Because it destroys the relationship. And if we can't trust each other, we got nothing. That's so we're really trying to parent on relationships and celebrate what's going on. Now, that does not mean that you're angelic 13-year-olds are never going to do something absolutely dumb that makes you so mad that you're just like, that's it. I'm selling everything in your room and, chaining you to the floor. You're awful. There's times that you're like, what's weird is that your kids will figure out exactly how to press your buttons. It's funny how that is. But the thing is, we can respond to issues. There's a difference between behavior and identity. So if the key thing in individuation is I'm trying to figure out who I am, not to get overly spiritual, and I don't know where everybody's background is here, but I think one of the most powerful themes that you see in Scripture, and this is something that Christians and Jewish people would hold in common, the role of the father in the biblical narrative was always to name their child, and the reason for that is because they're actually giving the child identity as a gift. There's something deeply symbolic about that. So as parents, what we say about who our kids are sticks with them. And there's a difference between me having a commentary about your behavior versus me making a statement about your identity. And so that's something that needs to be so we don't say to our kids, you are a liar. In fact, what I would say is be like, I'm just shocked. Like, you're so trustworthy and honest. Like, I can't even understand how you did this. This is a very different approach. And I would actually guarantee you that, not to make you all bawl your eyes out, but probably the greatest traumatic moment you've had with any of your parents in your own lives is something your parents said about who you were to them. If they looked you in the eye, if your father had looked at you and I said you were such a disappointment, that would stick with you forever. Because identity statements from your parents carry the world. So how we speak and how we celebrate is everything. And if we can, one of the things I say to youth leaders all the time is I say your job as a youth worker, but I would say this would apply to family members too. Your job as a person in the life of a young person is to carefully hold on to and safeguard their identity until they are mature enough to hold on to it for themselves. And so we safeguard it for them by articulating it to them of who they really are when they're not sure. And that's pretty significant. That's heady stuff. But anyways, we're going to keep moving. And then if there's questions, we can kind of come back. So if that's how we respond to adolescence. We try to celebrate it. We speak life. We bring affirmation into the process, especially because everything else seems to be chaotic in their lives. So I always just figured that if nobody ever really says good things to our kids anyways. Like at school, their friends are always being mean, and teachers just get cranky sometimes because they've just had 30 kids do awful things all day. And so I just figured if I was really good at saying great things, then home's now a place that my kid wants to come to. Because we control that environment, right? So that's celebrating. But anyways, moving on. The next thing we need to talk about is let's talk about how we respond to society, culture, and the world our teens live in. Well, now you have permission to be highly rebellious. So it's funny because I'm not saying your kids should be rebellious. I'm saying you should actually be rebellious. This isn't the place for teen rebellion. This is the place for your rebellion. So because if we want to really take a step back, and we looked at yesterday, is that our generation is creating a way of life that is highly toxic to young people. And we have this opportunity as adults who actually have real power. We have an opportunity to kind of rebel against the status quo. And I don't know if you've ever really thought about that, but the thing is, you really could do it. It's funny how quickly we get swept up into the patterns of society, the patterns of culture, and kind of say, well, you can't really do it this way because this is kind of the way it's done. I don't know that we need to necessarily go there. Because you get it as a parent, as a grandparent, you're sitting there saying, listen, the way we are doing society is killing kids. Literally, because the suicide rate is going through the roof. I'm going to do it different. I don't care. We're just going to do it so differently. This is actually the place where you have the opportunity to stage an incredible rebellion, because you need to give yourself permission in your home, with your peers and your social groups, to actually take a step back, look at the trends in society, and say, do we want to keep doing it this way? Could we do it more differently? To my point yesterday, when 54% of our young people are on psychotropic drugs, it's probably a good time for adults to sit here and say, maybe we should be doing it differently. So here's how I think we do things really differently. The key issue, of course, is what? It's isolation. So it means we become really, really intentional about adult presence in the lives of our young people. Really intentional. Everything is on purpose. Nothing gets left to chance. We start being really intentional about that process. And so one of the interesting statistics that we would look at is to say that teenagers who have 3 to 5 non-parental adults in their life that they trust do better in every area of life forever. That's the magic number. Now here's the interesting thing. Individuating means I got to figure out who I am away from mom and dad. So here's the trick. How about if you actually begin the process of intentionally bringing your young people into the circles with other adults that are highly trustworthy and giving them permission to be influential in the lives of your kids? And it's on purpose. Because there will come a moment when your 15-year-old is desperate for some kind of adult guidance, even though every one of their peers says you can't trust adults. But the likelihood at 15 that they're going to pick you is pretty slim. So, do you want them to Google it? Do you want them to reach out to the really, really friendly guidance counselor at school that you met once in a PTA interview in like grade 9? Like, that you don't even know this person, but they're there and they're at school all the time. We've got some parents, at our church that I believe are doing incredible job parenting. I mean, sometimes look at the way they're parenting their kids. I'm like, man, I got to take notes. I love this. And yet their kids are in a youth group. One of them got a message from a girl last night. She's 16 years old. Great kid, great family. They are just nailing the parenting gig. And she messages me and says, hey, can I get some advice from you? What's that? Well, we have this person, this friend of mine who's, kind of complex, but basically there's this girl who's living with them. She goes, she's breaking the family rules. She told me, and I'm not supposed to say anything, and I'm really sick because she's like, I love her, she's my friend. And I'm like, man, I don't know how to play this out. I feel like I need to be loyal to my parents, let them know what's going on. I don't want to torch this relationship. Where do I just needed to ask her some advice before I figure out what to do, because I don't want my parents to be disappointed in me. I don't want my friend to hate me. I don't even know. And see, here's the thing. So the fact that she's talking to me, is this failure as parenting that she's talking to me? No, this is the most natural, because she's individuating. She's sitting here saying, I value my relationship with my parents, but I need someone who's not my parent to bounce this off of, and all of my 16-year-old friends are giving me advice that sucks. So what does it look like? But part of the reason that's happening is this is a set of parents that speak much more highly of Amber and I than we probably deserve in any capacity. They've invited us into their lives of their kids and their families. So this is such a natural thing for her to be like, I could talk to Ryan about this. Just ask him, just message him right now. Right? And so what does it look like to really be intentional about this? And so here's some interesting things that, just practically speaking, we live in the era of drop off and go and text and pick up when it comes to bringing kids places. So here's one of the things that, we stole this from our friends, Rob and Candace, and we love it. And so every time I drop my 13-year-old off somewhere, I get out of the car and I go in with her. And I bring her in. There's a couple of reasons for this. I want everybody there to know that I'm highly involved in the life of my 13-year-old. She's not just show up anonymously with who knows who her parents are. And I come and I get her, and I will meet her friends, and I will do all of these things. You get to know some of the other adults who are in the room, and you start to build these relationships. Being really intentional about having adult presence in the lives of our kids. I won't text and pick up. I won't drop off and leave. I will park, and I will get out of the car, and I will come in with you. Because it creates an entirely different framework. Now that's not normal in our culture. And it's amazing, sometimes you can walk into the room and you actually have program leaders, you have teachers, you have other youth workers, you have other kids being like, what are you doing here? To me, I think that's insane. I'm like, I'm her dad. What do you think I'm doing here? I'm checking out who you are. So we start looking at the trends in society where children are isolated. You know what the other benefit of that is too? Do you know how many of those kids are more comfortable reaching out to Amber and I simply because we walk our kid into the building? Because she lets us? Because this is normal? We just became another adult in their world. Because their world is lacking in the presence of adults. If you will place yourselves in the places where young people are and be present, that is an act of rebellion in a culture that says really teenagers should just hang out with themselves. So that's just an idea. What are some other things we can do to rebel? Well, here's a crazy thought. We could teach our kids discernment. And so here's what I mean about that, is that it's interesting, when our kids are little, when they're 7, 8, 9 years old or whatever, we probably, be like, well, you can't watch that movie. Why not? Well, I checked the parents' guide, and it says that at one point someone says the F word while blowing someone else's head off with a bazooka. Blood goes everywhere. You're 9. Listen, you're not going to watch this show. But what's interesting is as they get older, there's this need to shift and actually begin to walk through the process with them where we teach them discernment. Now, you realize that rebelling against our society and the way we do things is going to take an enormous amount of time. Because the biggest rebellion we make against our society is to actually take the busyness out of our lives. Mark Yaconelli said it so well. He just said, maybe it was his dad, Mike Yaconelli. He was one of the Yaconellis, but he says, I think in our culture that evil just looks a lot like busyness. We're just too busy for things that actually have eternal significance, especially our kids. And this is challenge. So to take time and say, I'm going to watch it with you, and we're going to discuss it. We're going to have not like in a, oh my gosh, I don't even want to watch TV because every time we watch TV, there's a 20-minute parental talk right after. Not like that. But when you actually, again, you enter their world, you're present in their world. So when they're going to watch, be like, hey, can I watch this on YouTube? That's the question your 11-year-old is going to ask you. Can I watch this on YouTube? Oh, what's it about? Well, it's this and this. Yeah, let's watch it together. Oh, okay. We'll watch it together. Now listen, I get it. You are not interested even remotely in the Minecraft, commentary that they want to watch. Brutal. It's like, I'm trying to make dinner. Why? Why now? But listen, if you start becoming a watcher with them at the beginning of individuation and beginning to converse with them about what are we seeing? What are we hearing? What did you think about that? And you start asking a really good question. What did you think about that? What did you think about that? They said it this way. What do your friends think about that? Well, they think this. We're actually in this journey now of teaching discernment. Now, this is the most revolutionary stuff. Our society does not work this way. We kind of usher our kids into the next room, say, watch whatever you want, it's fine, as long as it's rated, whatever. I don't really know what you watched, but it didn't have any swears in it, so it's fine. And, and we kind of do that, but teaching discernment. And that way, as they get older, we've actually helped them develop their own conscience. And here's probably the biggest thing, is making intentional decisions about aligning the way your time and money is spent in your family with the things that we say that we value the most. So, we'll often, and this is where guilty. It's like the thing where we say, what do we value? We value quality time as a family. Okay. Look at my calendar over the last 2 weeks. Tell me, can you tell that I value it? And if you can't, man, I'll be like, oh crap, what have I done? So the thing is that we know that one of the things in the way our society works right now is that young people rest too little. They are driven to task too often. There's not enough connection with adults. Real connection, good connection. So the family time thing is really difficult to maintain. And what happens if you just completely rebel against the framework that society tells you to have, and you slow life down? And you actually live out those values. So one of the things we started thinking about is, what would it look like for family time to be an adventure and not a drag? Because usually, when I was growing up, what family time was? Family time was, we don't get to do anything fun. This sucks. Family time meant that nobody left the house, but everyone was still in a different room doing their own thing. I hated it. There's no intentionality to it. So you started thinking, well, what would it look like to actually create adventure? What would it look like to create adventure that's so great, especially when you're individuating, especially when you're trying to test the limits, whatever. We're actually going to family time's an adventure that your friends will be jealous of. Now, it's helpful that I'm a youth pastor, so I always have these crazy ideas because, like, for me, the way I would do all these things with 14-year-olds in the youth group is it would be like, hey, we're going on a camping trip, and you're only allowed to bring this, and guess what? We're making our own tents out of tarps. And kids are like, what? And their parents are like, are you kidding? I'm like, shh. We're doing it. And we go out there, and I would find the youngest kid I could, and I'd hand him an axe, and I would look him straight in the eye and say, listen, this axe is so sharp, you could probably cut your leg off, but I need you to go ahead and chop the wood. I was watching him, and he's like, like we're just like, it was so risky. I still remember this one kid named Riley, he was 14, and he's like, hey, I got this can of shaving cream. Can I cut it with the axe? I'm like, what do you think? I think I should do it. Okay, well then let's back up, let's do it. Everyone cover your eyes. You hit that thing. Man, it's just like a tidal wave of shaving cream everywhere. It was great. We just, these risky things. I get made fun of a lot because, we've got a missions team that's meeting on Sunday, and we've got 36 of them we're taking on this missions trip. And in their welcome package, we've given them all a knife with their initials engraved on it. Say, hey, we'll be out in the bush, and here you go. And it's so funny because I always get people being like, man, I just had our district youth director just say, because we're one of the 2 sites hosting History Maker this year, and we were talking about security concerns. He says, yeah, last year we had a kid who brought a knife to History Maker. Security had to take it away, and I'm like, I just armed half my youth group. We're hosting it. I'm like, we're literally causing the problems here. But the reason is because, again, you look at society is trying to make the world so safe for these kids. And listen, you know what the thing I'm really scared about is not giving kids pocket knives and letting them chop wood with an axe. I'm pretty sure that they were doing that stuff 100 years ago, and they all turned out pretty great. What I'm really, really terrified is not that stuff. What I'm really terrified about is, kids who are completely isolated from the adult world who are sexting. That's what scares the crap out of me. So we're just trying to create enough adventure and excitement. And so, we decided that when our kids turned 13, that Dad would take you on an adventure somewhere. And the rule, we got to go somewhere we've never been before. It's got to be something completely different. We're just going to go. And so my 13-year-old's been looking forward to this for a year. Right? We're just going. We're just going on this adventure. But that's what it looks like to look at saying, well, this is where adolescence is, and this is what society does. And they need more of these things together. Here's the one that you can either say, well, you can say ouch or amen, depending on how you feel about it. But, so then it becomes this thing of, in society, we're just, we'll talk about this in technology, but we're so addicted to our phones. So what does it look like to create spaces where there's none of this? Well, I don't want to take away from that. There's a whole thing about that. Anyways, this is part of it. Okay, so let's move on that note, let's talk about technology a little bit. Oh, you know what? Can I just give you a tip that doesn't fit anywhere else in my notes? This is just for free, just on the side. Just please, when you're talking to young people, never use the phrase, when I was your age. I know, because you're thinking about when you were a kid, and someone's like, when I was your age, and you're like, keep talking, Grandma. I get it. Do you know why it's even more important now? When you were their age, it was a very different world. That's a barrier statement, not a bridging statement. Well, when I was your age, when you were my age, they hadn't invented jets yet, great-grandma. Now, that's a hyperbole, but you know what it is now? When I was your age, when you were my age, the internet wasn't invented, Dad. All right. So, we don't use those words. In fact, what we do is we invite them into conversation and say, tell me about what it's like. And this is just, again, a side tip here, but if you want to get your kid to talk, don't ask them questions about themselves because they're terrified you're going to judge them because that's part of the underworld phenomenon. So you sit there and say, hey, what do some of your friends think about this stuff? You ever hear about this? Just tell me, what are people saying about this? It's amazing how much they'll have a conversation with you. Yeah, I hear a lot about this at school. It's not personal, right? We can have broach these topics, have these conversations. Okay, so let's talk about parenting approaches, especially we're going to combine society and culture and technology. So here's the 2 different approaches we're trying to get away from. Because generally speaking, what we see is there are two equally harmful, destructive parenting approaches to trends in society and trends in technology. So approach number one is the caveman approach. It's the parents who went home from the seminar last night, walked into the basement, just grabbed a hold of their internet router and just pulled it out of the wall, put it on the floor, bashed it with a hammer. The kids are like, the Wi-Fi's down. What are you doing, Dad? Be like, none of this ever again. It's just like done, right? Like we're not doing this. By next week you're Amish, like you've just bought a horse, and you're like, what? Your kids are trying to figure out what on earth just happened, They're withdrawn from school. You're living in one of those little like huts on the trail just up the road, like permanently. You're growing your own corn. Like, it's like, what is going on? We're just completely like, we're out enough, we're getting out. And here's the thing is it's hyperbole, but there are a lot of parents who, as they become aware of what the issues are, they see the depth of crisis and their response is like, can we just go into the cave, right? And we're just going to live in this cave, and we'll put this, put this rock in front of the cave, and eventually, when the storm blows over, and it's just this thing. If I could just keep my kids safe over here, we're just going to get rid of everything. Not helpful, because at some point they're going to have to live in that world, unless you're literally planning on keeping them in the cave until they're like, 50 or something. But then you're still going to have a 50-year-old kid who walks out of the cave and is like, what is this? And it's just no idea. Like, our job as parents and as grandparents is to raise really healthy adults, right? And that's a really good parenting paradigm, by the way, because I think what we get sucked into, our society says our job as parents and grandparents is to give our kids a great life. That is like the worst thing I've ever heard. That's not your job. Your job is to parent some really healthy adults. Like, when your kids hit adulthood, they usually be like, man, like my kid knows how to adult. Like, they are great adults. Like, wow, look how great they are at adulting. They're amazing adults. And the cost of getting there is going to be, getting away from this idea of like, well, it's really about making sure that they have a wonderful experience. It's like, well, yeah, that doesn't really work. So we want to raise healthy adults. We can't do that when we take the caveman approach. The equally destructive and opposite reaction is like the cool parent approach, right? It's the parent who just like uncritically, like whatever's happening, like, oh yeah. Usually it's driven by this obsession that, sometimes we have is like, oh, I just want my kid to really like me. And I would just tell you right now, like, if you're even remotely worried that like, if it matters to you, like, I really want my kid to like me, you're going to have to get over it because you'll be a bad parent. Like, actually, you just got to assume, like, my job isn't to make you like me. I got to do what's good for you. I got to love you really well, but like, you liking me in the process that is like step 10 on the tier. Like, that is just not in the top 3 in terms of how we're making decisions around here. Because the problem is that your kids are surrounded by people who are really worried that they're not going to like them. Like, their friends, all their interactions with their friends, that's why they get to play all these manipulation games, right? They just know they live in a society where people want me to like them. So if I withhold my affirmation and if I get kind of nasty, it means I can get what I want. And if that works at home with mom and dad, like, yikes, we're in trouble. And so the cool parent approach is kind of like, oh yeah, it's cool. I was give you this. Yeah, cool. Yeah, really. All the other 6-year-olds have like iPads. It's cool. Yeah, here's an iPad Pro. Sweet. We're so cool. Like, this is bad. This is not good. And so the cool parent approach, where you're going to take everything uncritically and just give it over to your kids, is really, 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 really unhealthy. Because the reality is like there's a reason why society doesn't let children make a lot of key life decisions. Like I just want to point this out, like, and personally, I would actually be a proponent of actually lowering the voting age in our country. I think it would actually be really helpful to grow kids up. But the reality is we won't even let kids cast a ballot for who the prime minister is, even though they're one of like millions. And that single vote is not going to sway. But we'll be like, hey, you can make all of your own choices about your bedtime, even though you're 10. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? And so we don't want to go there. So I think there's something better. There's something more intelligent. It's better than the caveman approach where it's clamp down, control all things. You become the drill sergeant at home and the cool parent who kids actually think you're laying behind your back anyways. So here's what better looks like. Better looks like, you can go to the next slide, better looks like boundaries. And our job, and we'll come back to this again and again, is our job is to help kids to create boundaries on and off the screen. And the key is to help them create, because when you think about the ages that they're at, when they're much younger, you're going to be creating these boundaries for them. Well, you kind of did that in kindergarten, right? It was like, hey, these are the boundaries, you can't go here. And then as they get a little bit older, what we want to move to is we're making boundaries together. And as we get a little bit older, we're looking at you're making boundaries, but I'm kind of signing off on them. And eventually it's you're making boundaries. We actually, one of the biggest things that we're seeing that's detrimental in the lives of young people is that they're in their 20s. I got a lot of, millennial youth workers I work with, and some of them are in their 20s, and they have absolutely no idea how to create their own boundaries. Because why? Because their parent was either the caveman parent who made all the boundaries for them up until they were left for university. Never once did they get to say, this is my boundary, this is the way I'm going to do it, because they just left and they're just like, I have no idea how to do this. Or boundaries were never created because their parents were too cool for boundaries and anything went. These 20-year-olds who they lose their jobs because they show up to work late because they're so tired because they went to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning all week long because they didn't set any boundaries and be like, this is not good for me to do this. And so our job here is to help our young people create boundaries for their lives on and off the screen. And there's some ways that we can do that. So let's talk about what are the spaces that are offline in your home. Creating boundaries. So one of the downsides of technology is a lot like water. It just takes up all the space we allow it to. That's the nature of it. It is ever expanding. So it will never not take up the whole space. You have to decide where it stops. And so when we look at, for example, specifically in this area of the way we experience the world, specifically in the area of technology and all that kind of stuff, if we don't set a boundary to say, here's when the phone is off, here's when the iPads are down, here's when the television's off and there's no Netflix or whatever, here's when it's unplugged. If we don't set those boundaries, our young people will never learn to set them for themselves. And so the really painful reality is it means the only way to do this well is for us to actually self-impose really healthy boundaries in our own lives and begin to model them for our young people. So here would be some thoughts that we can throw out, and I've got all this in a top 10 list that we'll kind of get into after the break, but what happens when you do a vacation and the adventure part is saying, hey, we're going to go on a vacation together? I want to show you guys this crazy thing. This is like old school. Man, I had to find this somewhere. What is it? Guys, this is a film camera. What? Yeah, I know. There's this stuff in here. When you take a picture, it's going to chemically change. Crazy stuff. I'm going to bring one cell phone. It's going to be powered off in the glove box in case we have an emergency. Everyone else, we're going to leave all our devices at home. We're going to go. We're going to take photos. And here's the thing. And then the photos are only for our family. No one else is ever going to see them. This is just private. It's going to be sacred. It's going to be a big thing just for us. We're going on this camping trip. There's not going to be any technology. It was really interesting is that is a disruptive act. But what you just taught your kids is that there are moments that are too sacred for social media. That validation does not just come from people online. That not every moment needs to be shared. We also taught them that they're not going to die when they don't have their phone attached to their hand every 2 seconds. We also are going through it ourselves saying, am I going to die with my phone not attached to my phone every 2 seconds? Right? These are adventures we take with our kids together, but when we actually do these disruptive things, we're teaching boundaries. Here's another boundary that we should have in our homes. If you are not yet filtering your internet to your house, that is dangerous and not wise. Because some of the boundaries we create are about decisions we make because we're in control, and some of the boundaries that we put up, like there are, talk to any farmer about the reason they have an electric fence where the bulls are. Because when the bull gets out of the pen, things can happen. That is a giant animal that can stomp on me. This is not an easy thing to intervene with. So we put electric fence. Why do we do that? Because we sit there and say, I can't afford the risk of that. There's a boundary that we create there. So one of the reasons we put router level filtering on our internets. Why? Because I want to make sure that my 10-year-old, my 12-year-old, my 14-year-old does not have easy access to inappropriate content online. The reality is when kids find pornography, the first time it's not because they're looking for it. Because there's an industry that understands that they have a highly addictive product that's far more addictive than cigarettes, and that if they can put it in front of a 10-year-old, that they're probably going to be addicted for life. They get that. Okay, it's not an accident that if you misspell certain Disney-themed websites, you wind up on hardcore pornography sites. Why would that happen? Come on. Because they understand what's going on here. So why would we leave? And so here's kind of the analogy that I would give you when it comes to technology and this idea of creating boundaries and the idea of really supervising too. Is like we would never drop off our 13-year-olds at the P&E and just be like, cool, have a great day, bye. Like I'll pick you up at 10 o'clock. We just wouldn't do that. We certainly wouldn't do that with our 10-year-olds. We wouldn't pay for our 10-year-old to get into the park and be like, hey, cool, well, follow the rules, see you later. But we do that digitally when we put a device in their hand with unfiltered access to the digital world. We don't let them go to the P&E because we don't know who they're going to meet. They're going to be like in the cotton candy line and some psycho's going to be like, hey, you want to see something? And that's terrifying. There's things that they should not do there. But we know better than to do that. But we'll do it digitally. You say, hey, here you go. I'm going to give my 10-year-old their own iPhone, data plan, unfiltered access to the internet. Okay, that just does not make sense. So when we're creating boundaries, the other thing we're doing is we're talking about time limits. We're trying to say if we don't put these limits, it's like water, it takes up the whole space. So when does it just turn off? So sleep deprivation is a critical issue. And by the way, sleep deprivation, you cannot deal with an anxiety disorder if you have irregular sleep patterns. So any good therapist who's helping someone walk through an anxiety disorder, one of the first things they're going to address is your eating and sleeping pattern. And your eating pattern is usually connected to your sleeping pattern. And actually, what most of them will do is they'll sit there and say, listen, we're going to get your clock back normal. You're going to get up at the same time every day, no matter what time you go to bed. And eventually, after 3-4 weeks, all of a sudden, you'll just get into this synced pattern where you will actually be able to go to sleep. The challenge is that sleep deprivation turns anxiety disorders, cranks them from a 4 to like an 11. It's just like, bam, off the charts. And we have young people that don't sleep well because they've got their phones access all the time. They're sleeping with their phone, and the internet's always on, and they can just, so they wake up at 2 o'clock in the mornings. They had just woke up or whatever. I'll just check my Instagram. Oh my goodness, someone posted that. Oh my goodness, my friend's stealing my boyfriend, and now I'm really stressed and whatever. And all these things are going on. Well, they're not sleeping, and that just, increases the problem. So we create boundaries because technology does not provide itself with boundaries. And so we turn the internet off at a certain time and say, and now it's time for bed. Again, we'll get into the top 10 lists of how we can do that. One last thing before we take a little break, because this has always come up. What is the appropriate age to give a kid a smart device? Like their own phone, their own iPad, their own everything. That's a big question, hey? I mean, if I were to answer that question with, some of the moms at, in my youngest daughter's class, they gave their kids iPhones when they were in grade 1. That was weird, but whatever. Do you know what the experts are now saying? This is shocking. This is new stuff. Experts are now saying that the magic age is 16. And they are concerned that giving a young person access to a smart device before the age of 16 may have long-term detrimental effects. Now, this is new. This is like 2018, 2019 research. But it's this research, when it was published, that prompted Apple to backtrack and say, we're introducing better parental controls and screen time monitoring, because they're actually really concerned about what this could do in a legislative context. Because when you've got MDs who are saying, hey, smart devices have now been out for over 15 years, and we've been studying them for the last 10, and after 10 years of research, all of us here at Stanford and MIT and Harvard and all these big schools, we've kind of done all the research for a decade, and what we're saying is that they pose a health risk, and so we don't let kids buy cigarettes until this age. We can't let them have these things until this age, and they recognize the economic impact of what that would do. And so they're desperately trying to self-regulate so it doesn't come to a point of legal regulation, because this is now what the research is saying. That's interesting. Now, here's the challenge, is that how many of those devices are already in the hands of young people? Here's the other challenge. Do you have any idea, do you know that World War III is not going to be started by Korea or Russia? It's going to be started by your 14-year-old who doesn't get to have an iPhone when all of her friends have one. Okay, that's where that's when it happened, right? Okay, call in the army, because it is happening right now in your house. It is bad. You got to worry about it. So this is the reality, is that we're now sitting at this place. Just remember though, there was a time where you could be 8 years old and walk into the store and buy a pack of smokes and be like, hey, cool, I smoke. People are like, hey, it's your choice. There was a time when that was the way it was. And then at some point we realized we shouldn't let 9-year-olds smoke cigarettes. That was just eventually people figure this out. So this is the research that's going on right now, and we're desperately trying to figure out what boundaries look like, and at what point does the law need to step in. So we can talk about how we navigate this, but I want to introduce that to you just to say that these are the kinds of conversations that are going on. So we're going to take a break. We're going to get some coffee, use the restroom, all that kind of stuff. And then when we get back, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what our best response is to the crisis when it happens. And then what we want to do is take a step back from that, and we're actually going to look at what those boundaries can look like very specifically. We're going to get really, really practical, do some Q&A. Does that sound okay? Excellent. Okay, grab some coffee, and then we'll keep going on this stuff.